Scary telling.
My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen in the doorway. My mind raced with possibilities of what could be happening to my child. Had someone taken them? Was it a ghost? Or was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? I took a deep breath and stepped into the room, the singing getting louder with each step I took. My eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of my baby. That's when I saw it, the empty crib, rocking back and forth as if someone had just gotten up from it. The singing continued, but now it was coming from behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew something was very wrong. I grabbed my phone and dialed my husband's number, hoping he would answer. After several rings, he finally picked up. "Hello," he groggily answered. "Something's wrong with the baby," I whispered frantically. "The crib is empty, and I can hear their voice singing." My husband's voice was instantly alert. "I'm on my way. Stay there and keep looking." I hung up and turned back to the crib, my heart racing. The singing had stopped, but the eerie silence was just as unnerving. I took a step closer to the crib and felt a hand grab my shoulder. I spun around to face my husband, relieved to see him standing there. But his face was grim, and I could tell something was very wrong. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. My husband hesitated for a moment before finally speaking. "I just got a call from the hospital. Our baby is there. They were brought in by someone who found them abandoned on the side of the road." I felt the color drain from my face as the implications of his words sank in. If our baby was at the hospital, then who or what was in the empty crib? And where was the singing coming from? We hurriedly made our way to the hospital, our minds racing with fear and confusion. The only thing we knew for sure was that something very strange and very scary was happening in our home. When we arrived at the hospital, we were taken to a small room where a nurse was waiting for us. She explained that our baby was in stable condition, but they had no idea who had abandoned them on the side of the road or why. My husband and I were relieved to hear that our baby was safe, but our minds kept going back to the empty crib and the mysterious singing we had heard in our home. We left the hospital and drove back to our house in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. When we arrived, we cautiously stepped inside, unsure of what we would find. The house was eerily quiet, and we could feel a sense of unease settling over us. We searched every room, but everything seemed to be in its place, just as we had left it. As we stood in the nursery, staring at the empty crib, we heard the singing again. It was coming from the baby monitor, which we had left on the changing table. I picked it up and listened, my heart racing as I heard my baby's voice singing softly through the static. But something wasn't right. The singing sounded distorted, almost like it was being played in reverse. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the singing stopped. My husband and I looked at each other, both of us feeling an overwhelming sense of fear and confusion. We didn't know what to do or where to turn. That's when we noticed something strange about the crib. There were marks on the inside of the rails, as if someone had been holding onto them tightly. I shivered, my mind racing with the possibilities. Had someone been in the room with our baby? And if so, why? We decided to stay up all night, keeping a close eye on the baby monitor and listening for any sounds or signs of trouble. But nothing happened. The rest of the night was quiet, and our baby slept soundly in their hospital bed. The next day, we went back to the hospital to see our baby and get some answers. But the doctors had no leads, no clues as to who had abandoned our child or why. We returned home feeling more confused and scared than ever before. We knew something strange was happening in our house, but we had no idea what it was or how to stop it. As we settled in for the night, we both felt a sense of dread settling over us. We knew that something was going to happen, something that we couldn't explain or control. And we were right. In the middle of the night, we were jolted awake by a loud banging coming from the nursery. We rushed in, our hearts pounding in our chests, and found the empty crib rocking back and forth once again. But this time, the singing was different. It was deep and guttural, like the voice of a demon. We stood frozen in terror, watching as the empty crib rocked back and forth, the demonic voice growing louder and more intense. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the singing stopped. The crib stopped rocking, and the room was silent once again. We knew that we had to leave the house, that we couldn't stay there any longer. But as we turned to leave, we saw something that made our blood run cold. A dark figure was standing in the corner of the room, watching us with glowing red eyes. And as we watched, it disappeared, fading away into the shadows. We ran out of the house, our minds reeling with fear and confusion. We knew that something was very wrong, that something was after us. But we had no idea what it was or how to stop it. Over the next few days, my husband and I stayed with family, too afraid to go back to our house. We talked to a few paranormal experts, but none of them seemed to have any answers. We eventually decided that we had to go back to the house, to face whatever was there and try to put an end to it. As we walked through the front door, we were greeted with an overwhelming sense of dread. The air was thick with the scent of decay and death, and we could hear a faint whispering coming from the nursery. We cautiously made our way to the room, our hearts pounding in our chests. And there, in the center of the room, we saw it. A small, black box, sitting on the floor. It was surrounded by candles and strange symbols, and it seemed to be emitting a low humming noise. We approached the box cautiously, unsure of what we were seeing. And then, as we got closer, we saw that there was something inside. It was a small, writhing mass of darkness, almost like a swarm of insects. And as we watched, it began to grow, expanding and shifting until it filled the entire box. Suddenly, the box burst open, and the darkness spilled out, engulfing us in its embrace. We felt ourselves being pulled down into the depths of the earth, where something dark and terrible awaited us. We screamed, our minds breaking under the strain of what we were experiencing. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went black. When we woke up, we were in a hospital room, surrounded by doctors and nurses. They told us that we had been found lying in the nursery, unconscious and unresponsive. We were both badly injured, with broken bones and severe burns covering our bodies. And worst of all, our baby was missing. The police searched the house and the surrounding area, but they found no sign of our child. It was as if they had never existed at all. We were both devastated, our minds broken by the trauma we had experienced. We spent years in therapy, trying to piece together what had happened and come to terms with the loss of our child. But we never found any answers. The house was eventually demolished, and the land was left barren and desolate, a reminder of the horror that had taken place there. And to this day, I can still hear my child's voice singing softly in the darkness, a haunting reminder of the terrible events that unfolded so many years ago. I couldn't believe my luck when I landed my dream job as a curator at the local museum. The salary was fantastic, and the work environment was amazing. It allowed me to spend more time with my family, especially with my 5-month-old son. My husband and I had recently moved to a new house, which was more spacious and had a beautiful garden. We were thrilled to have our own space after living in a small apartment for years. As a new mom, I was always paranoid about my son's safety. I would check on him every few minutes, making sure he was comfortable and secure in his crib. I had installed a baby monitor in his room, which was a great help in keeping an eye on him. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard my son giggling through the baby monitor. I smiled, knowing that he was playing with his toy, a bright red rattle. I continued with my nighttime routine, washing my face and brushing my teeth. As I was about to turn off the bathroom light, I heard a strange noise coming from the monitor. I listened closely, trying to make out what it was. It sounded like a faint rustling noise. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly made my way to my son's room. As I entered the room, I saw a chilling sight that made me freeze in fear. A rattlesnake had somehow gotten into my baby's crib and was slithering around him, and my son was reaching out to touch it, giggling as if it was a new toy. I felt my blood run cold as I realized the danger my son was in. The snake's rattle was shaking, and I knew it was agitated. I had to act fast before it struck my son. I tried to stay calm and slowly moved towards the crib, hoping not to startle the snake. As I reached the crib, I grabbed my son and quickly backed away from the snake. I felt my heart pounding in my chest as I ran out of the room with my son in my arms. I called my husband, who was working the night shift, and he rushed home. We immediately called animal control, who arrived within minutes and safely removed the snake from our home. I couldn't shake the feeling of fear and shock that had consumed me. I realized how lucky we were to have escaped that situation unharmed. From that day on, I was hypervigilant about my son's safety, and I never left him alone for even a second. It was a terrifying experience that I would never forget. The incident with the snake had left me rattled for weeks. I couldn't help but think about what could have happened if I hadn't gone into the room at that exact moment. I had nightmares of the snake attacking my son, and I found myself constantly checking on him even more frequently than before. My husband tried to reassure me that it was a freak accident and that we had taken all the necessary precautions to ensure our home was safe. However, my paranoia only grew, and I became obsessed with checking every inch of our home for potential hazards. One night, a few weeks after the snake incident, I woke up to a strange noise coming from our garden. I got out of bed and cautiously made my way to the window. As I peered out into the darkness, I saw a figure lurking near the fence. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that someone was trying to break into our home. My husband was working the night shift again, and I knew that I had to protect my son and myself. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911 as I made my way to my son's room. I tried to keep quiet, not wanting to alert the intruder to our presence. As I entered my son's room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a shadowy figure standing over his crib, watching him sleep. I froze, not knowing what to do. The intruder must have found a way inside while I was checking the doors and windows. I heard the front door open, and I knew that the police had arrived. I screamed for help, hoping that they would hear me and come to our rescue. The intruder turned towards me, and I saw his face for the first time. He had a sinister grin on his face, and his eyes were cold and lifeless. He reached for me, but I managed to dodge his grasp. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder, and I realized that he had stabbed me with a knife. I screamed out in agony, but the police arrived just in time to subdue the intruder. I was rushed to the hospital, where I received treatment for my wound. The intruder was arrested and charged with attempted murder, but I couldn't shake the feeling of terror that had consumed me. From that day on, I had nightmares of the intruder breaking into our home, and I couldn't help but wonder what other dangers lurked in the darkness. After the incident with the intruder, my husband and I decided to move to a new home. We couldn't bear the thought of staying in the same place where we had experienced such horror and trauma. We found a beautiful new home in a quiet suburb, and we thought that we had finally found a place where we could feel safe and secure. However, things took a dark turn when strange things began to happen. At first, it was small things like objects moving on their own and strange noises coming from empty rooms. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The feeling of being watched was constant, and I could feel a presence lurking in the shadows. One night, as I was putting my son to bed, I saw something that made me scream out in terror. A shadowy figure was standing in the corner of his room, watching us. I tried to stay calm, but my instincts told me that this was no ordinary occurrence. The figure began to move closer, and I could feel the chill of its breath on my neck. Suddenly, my son began to cry, and the figure disappeared into thin air. I felt relieved that the entity had gone, but I knew that it was only a matter of time before it returned. I decided to do some research on the history of our new home, hoping to find some answers. What I discovered was horrifying. Our home had been built on top of an old cemetery, and the bodies had never been properly relocated. The spirits of the deceased were still trapped in the land, and they were angry. I knew that I had to do something to protect my family, so I sought the help of a paranormal investigator. She confirmed my suspicions that our home was haunted and that the spirits were trying to communicate with us. She performed a cleansing ritual to try and rid our home of the spirits, but it only seemed to make things worse. The spirits became more aggressive, and their presence was felt more strongly than ever before. One night, my husband was working late, and I was alone with my son. I heard a strange noise coming from the basement, and I decided to investigate. As I descended the stairs, I felt a cold breeze, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I turned to face it, and I saw a ghostly figure hovering in midair. It was the spirit of a woman, and she had a look of anger and sadness in her eyes. She began to speak, but her words were jumbled and unintelligible. I tried to understand what she was saying, but it was like listening to a foreign language. As I turned to run back up the stairs, I felt a sharp pain in my leg, and I fell to the ground. The ghostly figure had attacked me, and I knew that I was in grave danger. I managed to crawl back up the stairs and lock myself and my son in his room. I prayed for my husband to come home and rescue us. After what felt like an eternity, my husband arrived home and found me and my son huddled in the bedroom. He saw the ghostly figure in the hallway and realized that we were in serious trouble. Together, we managed to escape the house, and we never looked back. We moved to a new city, and we never spoke of our experiences again. But the memory of the haunted house still haunts me to this day. I can never forget the terror that I felt when I saw the ghostly figure in my son's room, or the pain that I felt when the intruder stabbed me. Even though we have moved on and started a new life, I know that the horrors of our past will always follow us. I felt a wave of relief wash over me at 4 a.m. when I felt my son's fever break. As a mother, it's the worst feeling in the world when your child is sick, and there's nothing you can do to make them better. For the past few days, my son, Alex, had been running a high fever, and we'd been to the doctor multiple times, but they couldn't seem to figure out what was wrong with him. I had finally gotten him to fall asleep after hours of tossing and turning, and I couldn't help but feel relieved when I placed my hand on his forehead and realized that his fever had finally broken. But as the night went on, something started to feel off. I woke up around 5 a.m. to check on Alex, and I couldn't believe how cold he felt. I immediately grabbed a thermometer and took his temperature, but it wasn't registering. It was like he was so cold that the thermometer couldn't even detect his body temperature. I started to panic and called the doctor, but they were closed until 9 a.m. As the night went on, Alex just kept getting colder and colder and colder. I tried everything I could think of to warm him up. I piled blankets on top of him, turned up the heat in the house, and even held him close to my own body, but nothing seemed to be working. He was like a block of ice, and it was starting to scare me. I sat there in the rocking chair in his room, holding him close and praying for morning to come quickly. As the sun started to rise, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I had made it through the night, and soon I'd be able to get Alex the help he needed. But then, just as I thought things couldn't get any worse, I heard a sound coming from the corner of the room. It was like a faint whisper, but I couldn't make out what it was saying. I tried to ignore it, but the sound just kept getting louder and louder until I finally realized what it was. It was my son's voice, but it was different. It was like he was speaking from another dimension or something. And what he was saying sent chills down my spine. "Mom, I'm so cold. I don't think I can make it." I froze in terror, unsure of what to do. How could my son be talking to me when he was barely conscious and freezing to death? I looked at him, but his eyes were still closed, and he wasn't moving at all. The voice continued, "Mom, please help me. I'm so cold. I'm scared." I started to shake uncontrollably. Was I hallucinating? Was I going insane? I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that I had to get my son help, and fast. I picked up Alex and rushed to the car, frantically trying to remember the directions to the nearest hospital. The voice continued to speak to me, the words getting fainter and fainter as we drove. I couldn't understand everything it was saying, but I could hear my son's fear and desperation in every word. Finally, we arrived at the hospital, and I rushed Alex inside, screaming for someone to help him. Doctors and nurses came rushing over, and they took him away from me, telling me that they would do everything they could to save him. I sat there in the waiting room, numb and exhausted, replaying the events of the night over and over in my mind. Had I really heard my son's voice, or was it all just in my head? And why was he still so cold, even after his fever had broken? As I sat there lost in thought, a nurse came over to me and told me that the doctor wanted to speak with me. I followed her into a small room where the doctor was waiting for me. He looked grim, and my heart sank. "I'm sorry," he said, "but we did everything we could. We weren't able to save your son." I felt like I had been hit by a truck. My son, my sweet little boy, was gone. The doctor continued, "We're not sure what caused it, but it seems like he had some sort of severe hypothermia. It's very unusual for a child to get that cold, especially after a fever breaks." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My son had died from being too cold? It didn't make any sense. As I left the hospital, completely numb and devastated, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was something about that voice, something about the way Alex had been so cold, that just didn't add up. I knew I had to find out what really happened that night, even if it meant facing my worst fears. Over the next few days, I became consumed with figuring out what had happened to my son. I spent hours researching hypothermia, trying to find any information that could help me understand how a child could get so cold even after their fever had broken. I talked to doctors and scientists, trying to piece together the puzzle of Alex's death. But the more I learned, the more confused I became. Everything I found seemed to contradict itself. Some experts told me that it was impossible for Alex to have been as cold as I claimed he was, while others suggested that there might have been something wrong with his body's temperature regulation system. Despite the conflicting information, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on. That voice, that whisper in the corner of Alex's room, had been too real to ignore. I knew that I had to go back to that room to face whatever it was that had taken my son from me. Late one night, I returned to Alex's room, armed with a recorder and a sense of determination. I sat in the rocking chair, just like I had that night, and waited. It was quiet for a long time, and I began to think that I was wasting my time. But then, I heard a faint whisper, just like the one from before. "Mom, are you there?" I hit record on my device and responded, "Yes, I'm here." "Who are you? What do you want?" There was a long pause before the voice responded, "I'm cold. So cold. Please help me." My heart sank. This was the same voice that I had heard the night that Alex died. But who was it? And what did they want? I sat there, recording every word that was spoken, trying to understand what was happening. The voice claimed to be a little girl who had died in the hospital many years ago. She said that she was cold and that she needed someone to help her. I didn't know what to do. I had never believed in ghosts or spirits, but here was this voice, begging me for help. I tried to reason with it, to tell it that I couldn't help, but it just kept pleading with me. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave the room to get away from the voice and the memories that it brought back. But as I walked out of the room, something caught my eye. There, on the wall, was a small etching. It was the outline of a little girl, with the words "in loving memory of Lily" written beneath it. I felt a chill run down my spine. Lily? Was that the name of the little girl that I had been talking to? And if so, what did it mean? I spent the next few weeks trying to learn everything I could about Lily. I talked to hospital staff and old patients, trying to find anyone who knew anything about her. Finally, I found an old nurse who had worked in the hospital for over 50 years. She told me that Lily had been a patient in the hospital many years ago, before they had the technology to save her. She had died of pneumonia, alone and scared. The hospital staff had done everything they could to comfort her in her final moments, but in the end, she had died cold and alone. As I listened to the nurse's story, I felt tears stream down my face. This poor little girl, who had suffered so much, was still stuck in the hospital, unable to move on. I knew that I had to do something to help her. I didn't know how, but I knew that I had to try. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with the idea of helping Lily. I spent every waking moment thinking about her, trying to find a way to ease her suffering. I talked to psychics and mediums, trying to find anyone who could help me communicate with her. But most of them just told me that I was crazy, that there was no such thing as ghosts or spirits. But then, I met a woman named Ava. She was a psychic, and she claimed that she could help me communicate with Lily. I was skeptical at first, but something about Ava's presence put me at ease. We met in Alex's room, and Ava began to meditate. After a few minutes, she said that she could feel Lily's presence. I hit record on my device, and we began to talk to her. At first, Lily was hesitant to speak. But as we continued to talk to her, she began to open up. She told us about her life, about her family, about her hopes and dreams. It was heartbreaking to hear her story. This poor little girl, who had suffered so much, deserved so much more. But then, something strange happened. As we continued to talk to Lily, I began to feel a presence in the room. It was a dark and menacing feeling, like something was watching us from the shadows. I tried to ignore it at first, but it just kept getting stronger. Ava could sense it too, and she told me that we needed to end this session immediately. As we said goodbye to Lily, I could feel the presence getting closer and closer. And then, just as we were about to leave the room, I heard a voice. It was a deep, guttural voice, like nothing I had ever heard before. It said, "You should have left her alone. Now you'll never be rid of us." I froze. Who was us? What did they want with me? And why had they targeted Lily? I didn't know what to do. I tried to call Ava, but she didn't answer. I tried to leave the hospital, but the doors were locked. I was trapped, alone in the darkness. And then, I heard the voice again. It was closer this time, and I could feel its breath on my neck. It said, "We've been waiting for you, Sarah. You were always meant to join us." I turned around, and there, in the darkness, I saw them. Dozens of ghostly figures, floating towards me with outstretched arms. Their eyes were empty, and their faces were twisted into grotesque shapes. I screamed and tried to run, but they were too fast. They surrounded me, pulling me down into the darkness. And then, I woke up. I was back in my own bed, covered in sweat. It had all been a dream. But as I looked around the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the wall, was the same etching of Lily that I had seen in Alex's room. I didn't know what to do. Was it all just a dream? Or was Lily's spirit really trying to reach out to me? All I knew was that I couldn't ignore it. I had to go back to the hospital to try and help her find peace. As I got dressed and headed out the door, I could feel the eyes of the ghostly figures watching me. They were waiting for me, just like they had promised. But I wasn't going to let them win. I was going to help Lily, no matter what it took.